Hello everybody, I hope you're listening to this before you come into class because that's how a flipped classroom works. We're going to talk about providing patient-centered care through the nursing process in this chapter. The nursing process has slowly kind of morphed into what it is today. As you can see, it's been changed and added to over time. In 1955, Hall introduced observation, administration of care, and validation. Around 58 to 61, Orlando introduced three-step nursing process, which is assessment, planning, and evaluation. And in 67, Walsh developed the four-step nursing plan, which is assessment, planning, implementation, and evaluation. In 1973, the nursing diagnose was added to the nursing process, and then in 1991, outcome identification was added as a new step. So this takes us to the 5 steps, 6 if you count outcomes identified, that we use today. So it's assessment, diagnosis, outcomes identified, or outcome identification, planning, implementation, and evaluation. So the nursing process is a problem-solving method, and it's a necessary tool, if you will, that combines the art and the science of nursing. So to remember the nursing process, you will remember ADPIE, A-D-P-I-E, and just remember that now there is an OI, a little OI after the D, which stands for outcome identification. And we'll talk more about these as we go along. As a nursing student, you're going to hear us say time and time again, use your critical thinking skills, use your critical thinking skills. You have to employ critical thinking skills to make the nursing process work for you and your patient. As you use these skills, it will lead you to better clinical judgment, which you absolutely must have to care for patients, especially patients with really complex healthcare needs. As an RN, you'll now be responsible for creating an individualized care plan using the nursing process, because our job as nurses ultimately is to solve patient problems. Let's talk about assessment. The RN assessment involves the collection of both objective and subjective data about an individual, a family, or community. Objective data is information that is observed, and it leaves little room for interpretation. Objective data can be measured and verified. So these are things like your vital signs, the size and depth of a wound, the amount of urinary output. Whereas subjective data is information that's experienced and described by the patient. So that would be things like pain, fear, nausea. So you'll need to know the difference in subjective and objective data and what type of things go into each category. The 5 realms you will consider during your assessment are the physiological. This is the one we think of the most when we think of assessment because that's the assessment of the body from head to toe. You're going to also assess the psychological, which involves assessment that's more mental in nature. You're going to assess social, that's family and friends, the atmosphere the patient lives in, their habits, both good and bad. Going to assess cultural things. Are there health concerns due to cultural beliefs or habits? Will the client be more receptive if you present health information in a certain way? Does the culture value touch as healing? Or is it offensive in their culture for you to touch the patient, especially if they are of the opposite sex? These are all things you're going to have to assess. You have to assess their spiritual well-being. Will, let's say, allowing for prayer be indicated? Do they have specific customs when dealing with death? Do they regard health as personal and private, or do they covet things like visitation from a priest or church family? So you're going to avoid yes or no questions. An example, for someone who broke her leg, you might say, can you tell me about your pain? Instead of, are you having pain? And remember that the primary source is the patient. The secondary would be family, friends, or past medical record. So you always take the patient's word and thought first over the family and friends. They are your primary source of information. Again, we see here what subjective and objective data entail. So objective data, that's information that is observed and leaves little room for interpretation, can be measured and verified, and we've already talked about kind of what that incorporates. Subjective data is the experience of the patient. It cannot be verified as to its characteristics or easily even quantified. Examples would be feelings and experiences of the patients, uneasiness, and we said before, pain, fear, nausea. You can't tell how much pain they're in, only they can tell you that. That is subjective. There are 3 ways to collect all the data you need in your assessment. Okay, you've got the interview. That's your question and answer time. And this is where you will get subjective data obtained from primary and secondary sources. So from the patient and maybe from the family or friend that's with them. You're going to collect data through observation. What did you see? What did you hear? What did you smell? What's your general sense of the patient and their immediate environment? What's the big picture here? Then you're going to have your physical assessment, and that's going to be your objective data. This is where you're going to do inspection, auscultation, palpation, and percussion. So you need to memorize these. You can make up a mnemonic to memorize how they go in order. And I just kind of do that for about anything that I'm doing. You need to make sure that you're really familiar with these areas as well. Okay, Gordon's functional health patterns. He proposed 11 categories of functional health patterns that make a systematic and standardized approach possible. All right, so let's look at page 95 and 96, and let's go over and review these a little bit. And I am in your LPN to RN Transitions book, page 95 and 96. You're going to look at the pattern of health perception and health management, how the patient would describe their health and what they do to change or maintain it. You're going to look at the nutritional metabolic pattern. This assessment will include things like the patient's customs, their current health status as it relates to nutrition, their height and weight, any disease or illness that may affect nutritional or metabolic functions like COPD or kidney disease. You're going to look at patterns of elimination. How often do you have a BM? Has that changed recently? Is it the same color and consistency? The same for urination. Their pattern of activity. Do they get exercise? What do they do for fun? Their cognitive perceptual pattern. These are your mental functions. Is the patient able to express himself? What's their level of education? Why do we need to know that? Because we need to be able to communicate on the level that they can understand. What is their pain perception? Can they take a lot of pain or not so much? Are they able to make their own decisions? Those are all cognitive perceptual patterns. What's their sleep-rest pattern? How much sleep do you get? Is it good sleep, or do you wake up a lot? We need to be asking about their perception and self-concept pattern. This would be their body image, their body language. Do they make eye contact? Are they slumped and easily embarrassed? What is their role relationship pattern? How are your major roles going in your life? How's your job? How's your family responsibilities? How are your social relationships? Sexuality and reproductive patterns. That's patterns of satisfaction and dissatisfaction. And of course, we will approach sexuality on a case-by-case basis when it's appropriate. But if you're working in a long-term care facility for older people, don't think just because they're older that they don't have some kind of sexuality needs that need to be met, that you may have to adjust things to give them privacy to meet those needs. What about coping stress tolerance pattern? How do they handle stress? Do they have a support system in place? What about their value belief pattern or religious affiliations, their values and beliefs related to health? All right, so all of those were Gordon's functional health patterns. Now let's talk about Virginia Henderson and the identified 14 needs of the individual. The needs that Virginia Henderson identified are breathing, and think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs as we're talking about these. Breathing, eating and drinking, eliminating, moving, sleeping and resting, selecting clothing and dressing, regulating body temperature, maintaining adequate hygiene, remaining free from harm and avoiding harming others, communicating, learning and seeking general fulfillment, having spirituality, working, playing. This holistic approach assesses not only the biological needs of the individual, but also the psychological, sociocultural, and spiritual needs. Okay. Organization of data collection. It must be organized in a clear, systemic manner that permits logical progression of the data. So you won't talk about the tube they had placed in their ears at 2, then skip to how many babies they had, then return to something that happened as a teenager. For physical assessment, it's head to toe, right? We do it in the same systemic manner every time, head to toe. Many nursing systems have flow charting, but we will also be doing narrative charting. As a matter of fact, most of your charting for me will be narrative. And it has to be organized, it has to be clear, and it has to be systematic. So the same way every time. All right, validating. With subjective data, you may have to repeat back to the patient what you understood them to say. So you might say, I'm understanding you to say you drink 7 2-liter Cokes per day. That's the big ones. And maybe that they'll say, oh, no, I don't drink 7 2-liters. I drink about 7 cans. All right, so you may have to clarify or validate information or verify. With objective data, your coworkers are your go-to. You might say to your coworker, hey, will you look at this strip with me? It looks like atrial fib, but right through here it kind of looks a little different. What do you think? So it's okay to not only validate the information that you're giving, the subjective information that you're being given from the patient, but as well as the objective information that you see that you're not sure about.